presentation in context.
Good.
So this is not a original research work that I prepared. It's not a part of my research because I interest again in different things. But the whole the events in the war in Ukraine made me kind of analyze and rethink what is going on there, and basing myself on what I did and on ideas of transitional justice, which is the thing that actually connects me to Leora's projects. This is what led me to kind of try and think over about this topic. So I will just share with you kind of my thoughts, and I hope this will just lay the ground for more discussion in the context of this. In the context of this conference, and I think it actually ties in with Professor Crescen's opening yesterday. So we're going back to kind of assessment of the history and the way Russia uses it, and also, of course, to Anton's presentation, kind of the way Russia frames its understanding of the situation. So. So I think these Russian perceptions are important in order to understand what is going on. Maybe we can contribute in some way to trying to influence, or, I don't know, think about somehow ending this crisis. So the clash between Russia and Ukraine, I think I have a number of slides, really not a lot, but they might help. These with the citations.
I wanted to put it with the clicker. Okay, we managed. Okay, now let's see. It's working.
No, it's not the first one.
This?
Yeah. Okay. So the clash between Russia and Ukraine seemed at the beginning of the crisis as a geopolitical conflict over superpower domination. A clash between Russia and the West, NATO, sometimes, depending on the context of discussion, over influence in Eastern Europe in the 21st century. From the point of view of the United States, we could say this was largely could be perceived as an economic conflict over markets, who will dominate Eastern Europe and specifically Ukraine. And indeed, on the eve of the events, for example, in Maidan 2013, when the issue of concluding an agreement with Europe was at stake, we could argue that it is an economic matter. Moreover, since we all know the enormous sums of money transferred by Putin himself and his entourage to the West, one might think that this is the only valid, one of the main considerations, and rivalry over power. And this is something that might be resolved through negotiation. This is what the West was trying to do. Let's negotiate. We can have a certain deal between Russia and the West. However, I think that at this point, it is quite clear to everyone that the events which are taking place in the last 10 days in Ukraine are more than a war between Russia and its smaller neighbor. The framing of the crisis around the possible joining of Ukraine to NATO suggested that the bilateral relations between Russia and Ukraine are actually part of a much bigger conflict. But what conflict is it? A more careful attention, never mind. It's with me. I'll switch. No, it's fine. A more careful attention to the utterances of Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, or the people around him reveals that the war against Ukraine is much more than an economic matter and even more than a geopolitical matter. Russia presents this war, absurdly to us, as a war of self-defense. How come? Who attacked it? Why does it have to defend itself? As I will show in the next moments, I suggest regarding this war as a result of a war over Russian national identity, a war over the identity of post-communist Russia, and hence something that threatens the core existence of the Russian people. It is this identity politics which makes it an existential crisis for Russia, which mobilizes many, not all Russians, but turns it into a vicious crime scene. And while power politics and geopolitical calculations are central, in order to truly understand this conflict, I think we need to look into Russia's view of the 20th century also, even an earlier past. These are references that I allow myself to make to earlier past, not because this is that's something I choose to do, but this is something that Putin chooses to do in his speeches. So, in a way, this this is a discussion with what Professor Cresson said yesterday, although I suggest kind of a different nuance analysis and less focus on the issue of genocide, but more general reading of history. Okay, now it should work. Never mind. In 1991, when the Soviet Union broke apart and its union republics became independent states, it seemed that the Cold War was over. Liberal democracy won the battle of regimes. We probably remember that the 20th century was seen, or could be seen, as a story of a competition between different regimes. Fascism, Nazism, liberalism, and communism. No one knew which one would win sometime between the wars. But then, at the end of the Cold War, a liberal democracy won, and then the world was expecting to have a great unified universe. However, the transition from communism to liberalism and to free market economy proved to be much more complicated than originally assumed. And while some states, for example the Baltics, managed to go through the transition relatively smoothly, others still struggle with underdeveloped economy, corruption, political instability. You can see the Central Asian countries. But while for other countries, not Russia, the national history and culture provides a sufficient basis for a redefinition of their identity, this is much more of a problem for Russia itself. How should Russia define itself now that a 17-year-old long revolution turned to be a lie? What is Russia? Who is a Russian now? How should a Russian citizen deal with his or her national history, which includes a failed revolution, mass terror, and repressions? What is Russia if all the sacrifices, the terror, collective economy, were in fact crimes? For Eastern Europe, this was less of an issue. But for this situation for Russia entails a real challenge. And so, after the first post-communist attempts in the 90s to reform Russia. And after the economic and political crisis under Yeltsin, we all remember the 1993 again clash between Yeltsin around the White House, and then the collapse, the monetary collapse of 1997-1998. Putin comes to power, and his success in stabilizing the country, or we might say the fact that the stabilization occurred during his rule, and he managed to overcome the horrific 1990s, caused the population of Russia to be more receptive to Putin's suggestions for a new Russian national identity. But what is it? What are these core national identities? And here I would like to kind of point a number of possibilities, some of them based on researches of other scholars, and some are my own kind of interpretation and view of the events. So Putin comes to power, and he's trying to create this post-Soviet identity. And we all know that already in 2005, Putin stated in the Federal Assembly that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But what should be in place of that catastrophe? So we already pointed out the centrality of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, in this new national identity. But I would still like to kind of dwell on it for a moment. So part of what Putin does is to cultivate a new Russian identity, which is based on the victory of the Nazism in World War II. Heroism and defense of the motherland, presenting Russia as the savior of the world. This narrative goes against the Western narrative, which often ignores the contribution of Russia to victory over Nazism, a Cold War practice which divided the world into saints and villains. And of course, since the USSR is the villain, we cannot take into account its contribution with its whole complexity, occupation, and whatever, and to get all the aspects. So already beginning in the 2000s, school books were rewritten, parades intensified. Probably Anton could give more examples from his own work. Any dark moments of Stalinism and revolution erased. Towards the late 2010s, institutions which were researching Russia's and Soviet past were closed. For example, the Alexander Yakovlev Foundation, Memorial, all in order to create a new national identity. The revolution was ignored, and any lessons one could learn from the past were erased. And the Second World War became this only event in Russian history that could be glorified. No wonder that one of the slogans during this, the Ukrainian campaign was "Можем повторить," we can repeat that. But what can you repeat? If you know the horrors of the war, if you study the lesson, you don't want to repeat that anyway. But if you have only this glorious past victory, you can repeat it. And it's also not an accident that the war in Ukraine, we have again images, we have use of claims of neo-Nazism allegedly towards Ukraine. We have scenes that look as if they come from the Second World War. So this is kind of one direction Putin was going. A second core element in the new Russian identity assumes a certain nihilistic approach, not only to law as we used to characterize Russia, but as we discussed earlier regarding the post-truth elements, it has a certain nihilistic approach towards the functioning of political institutions. Putin's policy for years, through the many talk shows on TV, etc., tried to undermine a belief in a viable political policy, competition, and true democracy. work of Dr. Vera Michlin. Her book Fluid Russia came out, and she analyzes these talk shows and how they kind of bring about this fluid Russia, saying, well, there is no real Russian identity. So I choose to look at these shows as they're indeed kind of a playground to show that we are arguing, but then the result of this argument doesn't lead us anywhere. It only kind of negates the other side, but it doesn't bring another fruitful result. So these talk shows are seemingly a demonstration of free debate in Russia, but in practice for years they're a demonstration of disruption of politics, of civil agency and society, taking postmodernism to its extreme. So every criticism is ruled out by showing that the other side is also flawed, and therefore we do not need to answer any other allegation. Ideas of conspiracy are used, erasing any opposition. And in practical and political terms, Putin created a situation where the way you deal with opponents is you don't answer them, but you buy them out. This way, you achieve two goals. You eliminate a rival, but you also cause people to distrust the ability to resist and to reform the system. So Putin's kind of information autocracy, some call it this way, Treisman and Guriev write about it, they are regarding Putin's propaganda as an apparatus that was sophisticated precisely because for years it did not push forward a concrete ideology, but rather, because any other country pushing concrete ideology would remind people of the Soviet times, so we don't want to do it. But instead, the propaganda was that everything is normal, that nothing has to be changed, and that problems Russia has are in no way different from other countries. So therefore, you don't need to change, you don't need to intervene, you just need to continue leading your own life. Everything is flawed anyway, and in Russia, no, that's the other way. By the way, when even now, today, during the war, one of the, really absurd things is that when you speak to people in Russia, some of them say, well, it's normal, hardly anything changed. Those who are not, especially before the mobilization, people were saying, well, life continues. And this normalcy or false normalcy is one of the problems. The third element, I want to focus on is the one that leads us back to a discussion of history. So although communist ideology and socialist regime lost their battle to liberal capitalist states, Russia refused to participate in the liberal capitalist game and to join the liberal democratic world. Partly, this is because it was so difficult to change the course of a huge country, which for many years has failed, has relied on centralist power and the extraction of natural resources as the basis of its economy. Actually, there are studies that connect between state regimes and this extraction of, Alexander Etkin does that, an analysis of fur trade in earlier years and then oil and gas today. Partly this is part of the political forces, but an additional factor I suggest could not be ignored, that there is a years-long confrontation between Russia and the West that fixated a certain antagonism between the two sides, and this is not from the Soviet period, but earlier. In his book, Russia Under Western Eyes, Martin Melia observed the relationship between the two sides, Russia and the West, from Peter the Great till the collapse of communism, and notices that this tension between the sides grows not necessarily at moments of war or when Russia really kind of threats the West, but at moments when Russia seems different from Europe, when it assumes its own character, culture, certain ideology. And during the 70 years of the Soviet regime, Russia presented itself as the alternative to the West, as the holder of the truth about history and the way history develops. And Marxism was a kind of a deep criticism of bourgeois society, manifesting its own true democracy, proletariat, and true freedom and equality. But this clash between East and West did not begin with the Russian Revolution. In this sense, if Russia wants to erase the 20th century and go back even to the 19th, that does not really relieve this tension. Already in the 19th century, there were significant groups in Russia who emphasized Russia's unique character, unique way to modernity, which despised what they called false Western individual freedoms. The rift between the Slavophiles and Westernizers goes back to the 19th century. It revolves around the culture Russia should adopt and about the way it should define its identity. Mind you that Peter the Great, let's go back to this. For example, Peter the Great was the first one to introduce kind of European-style reforms to Russia, from clothes to cutting the beards of the boyars and nobility. Although here it's old believers, but I was looking for like this image. And the reforms of Peter the Great created already then a debate inside Russia about the way Russia, the path Russia should take. And the way Peter also used the European ideas, it was not exactly like using its clothes, its appearance, the way Europeans behaved, but not necessarily bringing European ideas. So the debate between Westernizers and Slavophiles, as Europe began adopting new ideas, so the disappointed of the reforms, Peter the Great first, but mainly Alexander II, created, and the assassination of the Tsar created a real clash between the two sides that could be seen. Okay, let's skip that. I think I'm running out of that. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So okay. Yeah. So it's really. So I'll bring two citations. One is from the 18th century. And really briefly, kind of one of the first attempts to identify a Russian identity and try to define it, and stressing orthodoxy, autocracy as nationality as its main character in 1832, and it stresses the unity of Russia, its admiration of autocracy, and in a way, if we look at what is Putin, if Putin is going back to Russia, erasing the Soviet period, we're again going maybe to these times. And I do want to stress the clash that existed in Russia. I'll just look at the citations. No, just the little ones. The clash between Western and kind of Westernizers and Slavophiles, I think is important to show that both sides existed in Russia for years. So it's not that the only voice you could hear was traditional Russian voice. So even Pavel Milyukov said history may have its worst wins, but it also has its flaws, and if the law of Russian history is progress, as we have tried to demonstrate, political reform may not be avoided. So some people are pushing for the reform, and others are saying that any attempts to change Russia is really kind of a failure and going against the nature of Russia. Okay, two more things, we'll skip that. So with this, I have two more things that I want to say. One is that if we indeed go to and examine Putin's speeches, for example, Valdai in October, we see that he stresses the fact that he wants Russia to take this special path to modernity. And although his criticism of the West, he has some valid criticisms, you know, the idea of neoliberalism and political correctness, and basing on that, he says, well, we should acknowledge a different path to modernity. One of the main problems is that the way Russia offers, the way Russia insists on its own path through using force, not accepting certain rules of political game, and in this way it undermines the basic demand of the West, saying that our procedures, our search for the political leadership, this is the main part of our idea. So the sanctity of the process as opposed to in acceptance is important. And so the last thing, and the really last thing I want to say, is that although Putin presents Ukraine as this state that unites with the West, in fact, I want to suggest, following this identity crisis, that it is a matter of an also internal and external civil war for Russia. So this is a point when Russians have to decide on what side they are. And the war in Ukraine also demonstrated that Russian people inside Ukraine are taking the Ukrainian side, not the Russian side. And this is a threat to what Russia is trying to promote. So, and Putin is not willing to accept.
Thank you.